I am David Plocher. Plocher. My grandfather always said Plocher, but in America it's Plocher. Anyway, and I'm a retired Wells pastor, and this is Naomi, my dear wife, of 62 blessed years. How about that? Yeah. And we want to thank Donna Tetzloff and Pastor Zuberbeer for the kind invitation to address you guys yesterday and today with all these pupils from your school. Is that all of you guys? 188, I heard. No? What? 4th through 8th grade only. Wow. Well, you remind me of my grandpa, Johannes Plocher. He was a student too, you know, and he was born in 1871 in the Kingdom of Württemberg, in the city of Holzhausen, Germany. And that's where he started out his life. And he went to school in Holzhausen, and he wrote about that. He said he was a serious student. You know, some kids like to fool around a lot, don't they? Yeah? Any of you guys fool around any? Yeah, I know. But he was a serious guy. And you know why? You know why he took his studies seriously? I'll tell you. Because, first of all, he knew how much Jesus loved him. How much Jesus loved him. And he wanted to love Jesus for that, all he did for him. But there's another reason. He went to school and he got confirmed over there, and he heard stories that came back to Germany from missionaries in India and South Africa and America. And that interested him, those stories, those mission stories. And God put a desire in his heart. He wrote later that he had a desire to preach the gospel of Jesus to the heathen sometime, perhaps, if he could, when he grew up. And you know, his wish came true. His wish came true. God answered his prayer. An uncle of his took him to America with him when he was 15 years old in 1883. And here in America, in fact, right here in Wisconsin, not too far from you guys, he met my grandma. And, well, that's her story to tell. And so, would you please give a warm welcome to my grandmother Anna, please.
Okay, all right. Well, as you can see, I'm a very old lady now. But God had a plan for my life, and it turned out to be a very interesting plan, and I'd like to tell you a little bit about that. My name is Anna Wilhelmina Louise Doedat. I was born in 1871 in a little place called Centerville, which is between Sheboygan and Manitowoc. But I spent most of my childhood in Fort Atkinson, where my father was the pastor at St. Paul's. I went to school there. Several of my siblings were born there. And when I got to be about 10, my father accepted a call to Oshkosh. But things did not go well in Oshkosh. We had not been there very long, and some doctrinal dispute arose in the congregation. Somebody was telling the people something that was not according to God's word. But my father, who stood firmly on the word of God, was in the minority, and he had to leave that congregation. He took 25 families with him, and he established Grace Lutheran Church and school in Oshkosh, just a few blocks down the road. Those were very difficult times for our family. Not only was there the problem in the church, but my mother, who had been ill for a long, long time, she died. And I'm 11 years old. I have 2 brothers that are younger than I and a little sister. We were so thankful when my father married again to Elizabeth Royal from Helenville. And they had several children together, although only 2 of them survived to be adults. Elizabeth was a dear woman, and I truly loved her. She was a gem. But things are happening in the world. God's in control. He is moving things around according to his purpose. Because among the other things that my father had to do besides his family and his church, he was responsible for some things in the synod at large. Now, the Wisconsin Synod is not very large at this time. It's not very old. It's about 30 years old. It was established in 1850, and your St. Peter's congregation was established not too long after that in 1858. But now it's the 1880s. And my father is in charge of the Mission Fund for the Wisconsin Synod. He is the treasurer. Now, the Wisconsin Synod, being only 30 or 40 years old, is not very big. And it's made up primarily of German immigrants who came to America looking for a new life, a new beginning. They didn't have much money. They maybe had 1 change of clothes, maybe a few household utensils and the tools of the father's trade, and their German Bibles, because they knew wherever they went, they would want to share the good news of Jesus and tell them how much Jesus loved them. But nobody had very much money, but still, every Sunday, they managed to put a few coins in the mission box. Their dream was to bring the gospel to people who had never, ever heard it before. American Indians, but all the Indian tribes in the entire Midwest are already being served by Christian missionaries, and there certainly isn't enough money in that mission box to go any farther. Now God's plans become evident, because he has control of all things. And about this time, the Synod of Wisconsin, the Synod of Michigan, and the Synod of Minnesota realized we are in agreement in everything we do and we say, but they weren't ready to get together and form one synod. They wanted to be independent, but maybe if we work together on some things, we can do more together than we could do separately. And so they formed a federation in 1892. And one of their projects was to be missions. So my father's mission fund has money in it. And about this same time, because God is manipulating everything, the great Indian wars of the American Southwest are coming to an end. Geronimo has been captured, all those dreadfully fierce Apache warriors have been carried off to captivity. Perhaps this is the time. So they asked two men, a Pastor Koch from Columbus and a Pastor Hartwig from Helensville, to go and check things out, which they did. And when they got to the Arizona Territory, it's not a state, it's just a territory, it wasn't much different than it was in Wisconsin. All the tribes were already being served by Christian missionaries. What are they going to do? But before they went back to Wisconsin, they stopped to visit with a Pastor Cook, who was serving the Pima Indians in Sacaton, and he told them a story. He said, you know, the American government is deciding that perhaps it's time to bring some of those Apache warriors back to their ancestral homes, to their families. And so they've built a military encampment at the confluence of the Gila and the San Carlos rivers, and slowly the African people Apache people are being brought back to their ancestral lands. Not Geronimo. He will remain in captivity forever, although he will become a Christian. But, said Pastor Cook, those Apache people, they have the most terrible, terrible reputation. They're fierce, they're unforgiving, they're anything bad you can think of, that's them. And there isn't a single Christian missionary who's brave enough to step into their midst. The men just looked at each other. They hurried back to Wisconsin and they said, we have found a people that has never heard the word of God and is in great need of hearing the word of God. We are going to have a mission to the Apache people. And so in spring, those three men who had, I forgot to tell you how they got to the seminary, didn't I? Because the mission fund had decided that they would put some of their money into scholarships to help fund young men who would prepare for ministry. And there were three men who took them up on that. Pastor George Adashek, who had come from Austria, Pastor Johannes Plocher, which Pastor Plocher had told you about, who come from Germany, and a Paul Meyerhoff, who was already, his father was already a pastor in the Wisconsin Synod. And that one man, Johannes Plocher, had relatives in Oshkosh. And he came to visit them. They didn't go to church, but he did, and he came to Greece. The services were in German, and he was happy. And my father would say, why don't you come and have Sunday dinner with us? And we would spend the afternoons. He asked me if I would help him improve his English, and he was a charming young man. And so, when those three men were ready to graduate from the seminary, a commissioning service was going to be held for two of them, for George Adashek and Johannes Plocher in Watertown at St. Mark's. St. Mark's is a beautiful church. My father was there with all the mission board and the Wisconsin Synod officials, and I was there too. I sat on one side because all the women and children had to sit on one side separately. It was a custom. And the service was wonderful. And if you are wondering why I made that long journey all the way from Oshkosh to Watertown, well, earlier that summer, Johannes Plocher had talked to my father and asked for my hand in marriage. As I said, the service was uplifting, it was joyful, it was happy. But the next morning, at the railroad station in Watertown, I was in tears. John finally took my hand and said, do not cry, my love. It will only be a year. I will be back in the next summer. Plan for a September wedding. Well, you have to know that everything that happened after that, I only learned from the letters that he wrote to me. And I wrote back frequently. He told of the long stage ride, the long train ride through the Great Plains, he saw buffalo. They called them buffalo then. They didn't know they should have said bison. They saw Indians riding horseback around the plains. They saw mountains. And when the railroad came to an end, they saw a stagecoach. John said, there wasn't any road. It was just a path through the desert, and it wasn't a very smooth path either, he said. Every time we hit a bump, we flew from one side to the other side until our shoulders were bruised, and if we hit a pocket of dirt and dust, our heads would hit the ceiling. We would fall, and our wheels would get mired in the sand. There's no bottom to any of those those holes, he said. The trip was 40 miles, and it took them 8 hours. But when they got to the confluence of the Gila and the San Carlos rivers, they went directly to the military encampment. And when the commander realized that John had good English skills, he said, would you like to teach in our boarding school? You have a picture of the boarding school, I believe, here. It looks like any school that you could have found in the Midwest during those days. It's 2 stories, it's made out of stone, has 4 classrooms, and it's designed to be able to teach the Apache people English skills and how to be good Americans. You can teach religion, they said, twice a week, but it had better be generic religion. You can teach the Bible, but you better not teach Luther's catechism. Still, after several months, John wrote to me and he said, I have 86 children who can recite over 70 Bible passages perfectly and without error, and can sing a number of Christian hymns. Your principal will give you a test on that later, see if you can do that, right? The men found a place to stay at the trading post, and they started to get acquainted with their new neighbors. The Apache people had settled in their wickiups around the base and sometimes in the ravines and the valleys leading down to the San Carlos River. A wickiup is kind of not a teepee which is pointed, it's kind of rounded, and they often would build 2 of them. They would build one very snug and warm and tight with a place for the fire in the middle and a hole in the ceiling. And then next door to that, they'd build another one, a little bit more loose, so the winds and the breezes could flow through and the fire was outside. And if someone died, those wickiups were burned to the ground so that the spirit of the dead person could not return and haunt that place. Language was a problem for him. The Apache language is a very, very difficult one. It's very nasal. It depends on whether you're speaking the word high or low. The meaning changes. It depends on your facial expression. You don't have to say, why don't you go over there? You just say, with your mouth, or over this way with your mouth. And they need to learn that too. And then, worse than that, the Apache language doesn't have words for things like grace, undeserved love. No. There's a great spirit who made us all and gave us our land, but we have to do things to deserve his grace, his love. Undeserved love? Hard to explain. They didn't know words like faith and redemption, atonement, justification, all those words that you know so well. It was going to be a struggle. Fortunately, the Apaches were also learning a little bit of English because they're working with the American government. And so conversations were possible. They did get to know people, quite a few of them. One of them particularly John commented in one of his letters to me, he said, I have met a chief cazador. Chief cazador is probably the most, well, he's the most influential, the most trustworthy, the most industrious, the most gentle of all the chiefs that I have met in this entire area. And Chief Cazador, called by John, his great good friend. So that when the men said, we are looking for a place to establish a mission station, Chief Cazador said, I've got some land I can give you. I've got 10 acres over on the slopes of the Great Peridot Mesa, and I would be willing to give them to you. Now, the Great Peridot Mesa loomed over the entire area. It was huge. It was magnificent, flat-topped, of course, volcanic, and filled with the gemstone peridot. I'm wearing some here. It's probably one of the largest peridot mines in the entire world. There are very, very few places where they can be mined, and here on the slopes of the Peridot Mesa, they could be mined, but only by the Apache people, even to this day. The men were pleased. It was a good location, they thought, but one of Chief Cazador's men was heard to say, those 10 acres, they are possibly the worst in our entire vast holdings. But still, arrangements were made with the government, with the United States government, for a 99-year lease on that property. And those two men, George Adishek and Johannes Plocher, pitched their tent on the slopes of the Great Peridot Mesa in the winter of 1893. George Adishek wrote to the mission board, and this is what he said. He said, it is so cold here. We would spend our entire day huddled behind our stove, if we had a stove. But as it is, we wear our overcoats to bed at night, and there's an inch of ice in our water basin in the morning. It's awful. And then, a couple months later, in early June, he's writing to the mission board again. And this time he says, it is so hot here. We cannot decide whether it's worse inside of our tent or outside. The sun beats down unmercifully. The wind, when it blows, it only blows hot. Why don't we just leave this land to the Indians and go home? Poor George Adishek is having problems. The climate obviously is not agreeing with him at all. And he's having trouble with language. He had come recently from Austria. He still thought in German. From German to English to Apache to English, German got a little complicated. And it was hard for him. He said, if only our dear professors at the seminary would teach more of their classes in English instead of German all the time, maybe I'd be a little bit more proficient at it. So the climate is not good for Pastor Adishek. The language is a barrier for Pastor Adishek, and he's got a few health problems besides. So he simply asks the mission board to reassign him to a nice German congregation in Wisconsin. And by the middle of June, he's gone. And my John is there all alone. And besides visiting with the Apache people and sharing the gospel with them and telling them the good news about Jesus, he knows he has to build a house, because I'm not going to live in that tent thing, you know. So he wrote to the mission board, and he said, I would like to build a parsonage. And they wrote back, and they said, of course, this is what you'll need. You'll need lumber, you'll need shingles, you'll need nails, you'll need this, you'll need that, and here's the directions or the plans, and here's the list of materials. John took one look at that, and he said, what works in Wisconsin is not always a good choice in Arizona. If we were to build out of lumber the way you suggest, the winds would blow, the sun would beat down, and pretty soon all those boards would split, they'd crack, they'd warp, and we would spend all our days patching, and we'd never get around to preaching the gospel at all. I think we will build out of adobe, the sun-baked bricks that are used in this dry climate. And we will build walls that are thick, so we will be warm in the winter and cool in the summer. And it'll probably be cheaper. So the mission board agreed. Most of the time, writing to the mission board was a pleasure. They were happy to be helpful and do what they could. After all, John's father-in-law was the treasurer. But they did have one other problem. They needed some barbed wire. Now, the Apaches were given barbed wire for free, but he was going to have to pay for his own. Why do you need barbed wire? You're living in the wide open spaces. Besides, Pastor Cock and Pastor Hardwick, they never saw any fences all the time they were there. Well, said John, you know, Apaches have a custom. If land is not marked by a fence of some sort, anybody can settle there, and they will. And do we really want neighbors that close? And besides, if you don't have fences, how do you keep track of your horses or your cattle, or keep things from getting into your gardens? And then he asked, would you kindly ask Pastor Cock and Pastor Hardwick if they could explain, since there are no fences, just how I got this large tear in my overcoat crawling through one of them? Well, he got his fencing. But before he could get very far with the house, the mission board had another project for him. We want you to explore a spot for a second mission station to the White Mountain Apaches on the other side of the Salt River Canyon. Okay, said John, I will be glad to do that. But when he started talking about his plans, Chief Cassador said, well, if you wait until I have my harvest in, I can go with you, which seemed like a very, very good idea. So, early one July morning, John saddled up his horse, attached the necessary provisions, put on a bedroll, everything he needed, and set out to meet Chief Cassador. Chief Cassador had a friend with him. Actually, it was his nephew Norman. Norman had gone to school in Pennsylvania, in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, where the United States government had maintained a school for Indian children to teach them English, to teach them how to be good Americans, and they probably taught him a few bad habits along the way as well. But at least he could be a translator. So Norman was coming along. John wrote, and he said, we started at an early pace, at a slow pace, because we knew we would be climbing all day long, up and up, down through a canyon, up through the other side, down through the next canyon, up through the other side, and on and on and on. Cassador could tell stories about those canyons. He could tell stories about battles and meetings with other Indians. And when you saw cattle up on the hillside, he could point out exactly which ones were his. And so they rode until they finally reached the top. A mesa, flat, black. It was called the Black Mesa. It stretched for miles. John said, with a sigh of relief, we dropped our reins, dug in our heels, and our horses flew across the mesa in true Indian fashion until they got to the Salt River Canyon, which was straight down, across the river, and straight up this other side. It was a formidable barrier. But fortunately, Cassador knew the switchbacks to get down and across and up the other side. But then it was night, so they pitched their tents, or they settled down. They didn't have tents with them. And you know, my John had a big long rope with him because it was known by everybody that if you put a large rope around your campground where you're sleeping, the rattlesnakes won't ever cross the rope, so you would be safe during the night. But they weren't going to get any sleep that night at all, he said, because it started to rain, like it was this morning, and then the mosquitoes started. He says Cazador finally just lit his pipe and spent the entire night telling stories about battles with Mexicans and dealings with other tribes. And then all of a sudden it was morning, and off they went to Camp Apache. 3 dusty, dirty, kind of grimy-looking men, 2 of them with long black hair and kind of dark complexions, so that when they got to Fort Apache and asked for accommodations for the night, the lieutenant commander took one look at them and said, "We have no accommodations for anybody." "Okay, I'll stay with my friends," said John, "but I do want to talk to the commander." The commander was very, very pleased to know that a mission station would be established in his area. Christianity is good for civilization. It teaches respect for a higher authority. It teaches kindness and goodness and a willingness to cooperate with other people and work together. It would be a blessing. And then the commander said, "You are staying the night?" "No," said John, "this is what happened." He said, "It got kind of loud. There was a lot of shouting. There were a lot of orders given. And when the dust finally settled," he said, "I did have a bed for the night. My horse was being cared for in the military stables, and I was to dine in the officers' mess." And then the next morning, off to find the White Mountain Apaches. Chief Alchazay was the head of that group of Apaches, and he was a fine, upstanding man. He had helped capture Geronimo, and eventually the United States government would give him the Medal of Honor. He too was excited about the possibility of a Christian mission in his area. It would be good for his people, he said. "I will do everything I can to help." And so the 3 men went back to Paradise. And then it was time to build the house. The sun-dried bricks were already dry in the sun. The Apache people were willing workers as long as the work wasn't too hard and they got paid regularly. And the house was finished. And the summer was at an end. And then it was September. And I was a bride. And before I knew what was happening, I was on that train through the Great Plains. And I was looking at the bison and the Indians and everything. And I saw mountains for the first time. I also rode on that stagecoach, and it was every bit as bad as John had said, and maybe even worse. But I didn't care. I was coming to my new home. I was going to be living in a parsonage with my husband. It was going to be glorious. I'd always grown up in a parsonage. I knew what to expect. Parsonages are big. Parsonage has 2 stories. They have lots of bedrooms, a big kitchen, and a bigger drawing room, and every convenience you could possibly want. And this is just 3 rooms. It's only 3 rooms. What am I going to do? And there's only a path to get water from the pump, and there's another path over here to the privy, and there's creepy crawlies on that path, and they're bigger than anything I've ever seen in Wisconsin, like scorpions and tarantulas and toads as big as your hand. I don't think I'm going to live here. I think I'm going to go home. I think I'm going to I don't know what I'm going to do. And then I turned around, all the way around, and I looked across the valley, across the San Carlos Valley, that little ribbon of green next to the river itself, and off in the distance there's a mountain. Now there's mountains on this side, and there's mountains on that side, and there's more mountains behind us, and there's a great big Mount Trimble over there. But this one, it's a little mountain, and it has 3 peaks on it. They called it Mount Triplet. But looking at that little mountain all by itself, I knew It was going to remind me of the triune God. My God will care for me. He will look after me. He will protect me. He will be by my side, and he will help me in all my problems because he has promised to be with me wherever I went. He is my Savior. I can trust in him to care for me no matter what I am to face. And so I turned around and I took off my fancy clothes, Wisconsin clothes, and I put on my apron and I became a missionary wife. But it wasn't easy. It's a totally different people. They dress differently from the way I do. They look different from the way I do. They have different customs than what I am used to. They carry their babies in something like this. They tie them in. Can you imagine that? And they either put them on their back or they even sometimes hang them in a tree. Oh, my. They wear things that they call camp dresses, which are very full and fancy and always with a long, big top over the top. They talk a different language. Their customs, I'm not going to get used to them. Do you know, they do not even knock when they come to your door? They just walk right in. And they did, several of them. They walked right into my house and they looked around and then they kind of poked around and then they started looking around and they looked under things. They looked under the chairs. They looked under the tables. They looked under the bed. They started opening cupboard doors. They started picking covers off of things and opening drawers. And all the time they're talking in a language so fast I cannot begin to understand it. And the only word I can hear is lice. 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 I'm a good housewife. I'm trying. But lice in a pot? I could not wait for those people to leave. I was absolutely in tears. And when John came home, I told him all about it. And I wanted nothing more than for him to put his arms around me and hold me close and let me cry on his shoulder. You know what that man did? He stood there and laughed. And he laughed and he laughed and he laughed. Oh, Anna, he said, they don't talk about lice. They're talking about rice. The government gives them commodities several times a week, and they love the stuff. They know that if you have some, you will share it with them because that's what they would do for you. And besides, the Apache language does not have an R sound, so they can't say rice. It always comes out lice. Well, you have to admit it was pretty funny. And you know, I got to know those ladies. I got to know and love them dearly. They came often. Sometimes they'd come and they'd stay all day. And when they noticed that I had combs for I had long, beautiful hair back then. When I had combs for my beautiful hair, they were interested. And so we'd sit outside under the shade, because I still remembered a little bit about lice, and I'd comb their beautiful long hair. Sometimes they'd bring their daughters with them. Their daughters with hair down their backs, shiny, black. Did you know an Apache girl will never, ever cut her hair? If she were to cut her hair, no one would ever marry her. Who would think of marrying a girl who cut their hair? It simply wasn't done. And so they continued to grow beautiful, long hair. I sewed for those ladies too. I was happy to sew. If they brought me material, I would sew clothes for them, and they were pleased. I sewed clothes for the children at the school too, because John, when he built our house, also built a small one-room school. He wanted to be able to teach more of God's truths to the children than he could do at the boarding school over in San Carlos, which was 9 miles away. But it was a very simple school. It was one room. It had benches, but had no blackboard. It had no books. It had nothing to write on. All they had was John talking and an interpreter helping with the language. We needed something. We needed books. Finally, the school over in San Carlos did give us some used textbooks, but what we really, really wanted was Christian books, the sort of things you have in your school. Bible stories, hymn books, Bibles, whatever. And so one day when a huge crate came from Brumder's in Milwaukee. Brumder's is the publishing house in Milwaukee that does all the publishing for our synod. It publishes Bibles and hymn books and everything that the schools need and the Sunday schools need. This is going to be wonderful. This is just what we need. We could hardly wait to open that packing box. And I want you to know we were always careful opening those packing boxes because they were made out of wood and we could use that wood again to build something else. Wood is precious in the high desert country. But when we finally got that crate opened and we took off the covers, all those books were in German. It's hard enough teaching them English, I said, but now we have to teach German too. It was a struggle. When our little daughter, Marguerite, was about a year old, the mission board decided that it was time to think about the second mission station among the White Mountain Apaches. And remember that third man who took one of those scholarships? His name was Paul Meyerhoff, and he was called to be the missionary to the White Mountain Apaches. The seminary had very good teachers and very good professors. They taught their young men how to be good pastors, how to teach, and how to preach. But they didn't have any classes on how to be a missionary to the heathen, because nobody had ever done that. So it was decided that Paul Meyerhoff would come and stay with us for a month. He would learn the customs of the people, he would try to learn the language, and he would learn customs and things that he would need. Language, of course, was a problem. My John had written a dictionary, some 200 pages, and Paul Meyerhoff copied it all down carefully. He followed John to the different camps where the Apaches had settled. He watched how John shared the word of God with them and how he gathered them together for worship and for teaching. He tried hard. And the one thing that he had to learn was most difficult was he had to learn to ride a horse. Apache boys can ride a horse just about as soon as they can walk. And for Apache men to watch a grown person climb up one side of a horse and fall off the other side, they just couldn't keep a straight face at all. They simply stood around and laughed, and they laughed, and they laughed. And the harder they laughed, the harder Paul Meyerhoff tried, until he started laughing with them. And soon they were laughing together, and the Apache men were offering suggestions. And before long, Paul had mastered the art of riding a horse, although he always said, my bottom never got used to all those long hours in the saddle. And then it was time. It was time to go to the White Mountain Apaches on the other side of the Salt River Canyon. John had sewed a tent for him, and off they went. They got all the provisions they needed, found their way, and when they finally settled him on the East Fork of the White River, and were sure that he had everything that he needed, they left him and said goodbye. Paul Meyerhoff was still puttering around his tent when he heard hoofbeats in the distance, loud hoofbeats. He looked up and there was a great big warrior chief and several of his warriors thundering down at him. They came to a stop right in front of his tent. They reared up on their saddles and he shook his fist, that chief did, and he shouted as loud as he could, "You're on my land. Now get off. Get off now." "Well, I'm not going anywhere," said Paul Meyerhoff in his best Apache. "I intend to stay right here." "Well, if you're going to stay, you can stay tonight. But if you're not gone by morning, I'm coming back and I'm going to burn down your tent." Well, poor Paul Meyerhoff is not going to get any sleep that night. And he's lying awake in his tent, wondering what he's going to do. And he hears something or someone is creeping into his tent. It's a woman. She beckons to him, "Come with me." And he goes because he can't keep her in the tent at all. That wouldn't be proper. And he led her here. She led him a long ways away through the desert until they came to a place where there must have been 100 or even more than that Apache people gathered. It was a ceremonial dance that was destined to last all night. The drums were beating, the dancers were dancing, the singers were singing, and there were people milling about everywhere except where Paul Meyerhoff was standing, because everybody was avoiding him. He was a stranger. And then Chief Alchazay and his friend Chief Cooley noticed him, and very quietly they made their way through the throngs of people until they reached Meyerhoff's side, where they stood and they talked to him for a long, long time. That was a signal to all the Apaches who had gathered there that this strange man with the pale, pale skin and the light-colored hair, that this man was a friend of the chiefs, and they owed him their respect. Can you think of anything more wonderful than that? If you're going to start a mission in a strange place where you don't know the people or you don't know their customs, and the chiefs say, "This man is a friend of ours. Listen to him." And they did. Paul Meyerhoff went back to his tent that night, and I think he got a good night's sleep. But in the morning, there's old Chief Y1 bearing down on him again with all his warriors, and he's still hollering and he's still yelling, "You're on my land. Get off. I told you to get off. I told you to leave. Now get off now." "I am not leaving. I intend to stay here." "Well, if you're going to stay, you better pay me $5, and you can stay for 8 days. So Pastor Meyerhoff paid him the $5, and he stayed for 8 years. He took his Bible wherever he rode on his horse. The people welcomed him. He had a small problem because White Mountain Apache is different from San Carlos Apache. And he'd copied that dictionary, and it wasn't doing him a whole lot of good. He was going to have to learn the language all over again, which he did. He had a very good ear for language. And soon people were saying, he can speak Apache as well as we do, maybe even better. And then he became famous because he could speak White Mountain Apache and he could speak San Carlos Apache. He could speak 2 languages. Never mind that he could speak English and German and Latin and New Hebrew and Greek. That wasn't important. He could speak 2 Apache languages. And people respected him, and he did well. But meanwhile, back in Peridot, things are happening. First of all, we have a little daughter. Her name is Marguerite, and Marguerite she's just not doing well. There were babies in our family. I knew what babies were supposed to be doing, and she's not. Something's wrong. And then she fell over in her chair, and I thought she was going to die. She lay there so still. I think that's about the time when John and I just looked at each other and realized that our Marguerite was a very, very special gift from God. She was a special child, and we would care for her for the rest of our lives. She'll live to be 93 years old. She'll never walk. She'll always have the mind of a child. But oh, we loved her dearly. The school that John is teaching at is also having a few problems at this time because it's attendance. Sometimes they'd come for 2 days, and then they'd be gone for 3. Or else they'd come for a week, and you wouldn't see them for 2 more weeks. And sometimes there'd be 6 children in school, and sometimes there'd be 26 children in school. It's like starting over every single day, said John. I don't know what to do. So he said, I'm going to go and talk to Chief Cassador about this, which he did. I need those children in school, he said. They need to learn. They need to learn about Jesus. They also need to learn a little bit about English and math and those things too. Well, said Cassador, you may think you need those children, but we need them right here in our camp. They are the backbone of our camp. They do all the work, mostly. They help gather the sticks for the morning fires. They keep an eye on the ponies for us. And how are we going to teach them to be good warriors if they're at your school all day long? Well, it was only till noon, but. And then Chief Cassador had kind of a gleam in his eye, and he said, well, you know, if you would pay me $1 a child, I could make sure they'd be in your school every single day. Well, John was horrified. I can't do that, he said. No. And he turned around and he left. But you can't keep a secret very long in an Apache camp. And pretty soon people are talking and they're saying, our Chief Cassador is making secret plans to sell all of our children to that tall white Inuit over there. And they were horrified. They wanted to get rid of their chief. They weren't just going to send them away. They were talking lynching. Somebody rode over and told my John what was happening, and he got on his horse, rode as fast as he could to the camp, where he very carefully, in his best Apache, explained to all the people that no, he had no intention of buying all those children. He wouldn't have any idea how to feed them or take care of them or anything. He really only wanted them in school till noon every day. The people listened to him. And Chief Cassador's life was spared. Chief Cassador was so grateful that this is what he gave to my John. It's a formidable weapon. You made one when you became an adult, and you used it for the rest of your life for everything that needed doing. If you got it sharp enough, it would cut. You could use it to dig. You could tie a handle on it. You could use it like an axe. You could use it like a weapon. You could use it as a doorstop if you had a door. And this is what he gave my John. What a treasure. Those two men had a great affection for one another. It was about that same time that I realized that I was pregnant again and that we were going to have an addition to our family. Marguerite's birth had been a very difficult one, and my John just didn't want to have us to go through that again. And so he said, why don't you go back to Wisconsin and stay in Oshkosh until the baby is born? Your mother will help you take care of Marguerite. And so we went. And it was lovely. It was so nice. I could sit and talk to Pa and Ma all day long if I wanted to. My brothers were off at school learning to be pastors themselves, but there were the little ones. It was a joy. And I could walk down a street. I could push Marguerite in her buggy on a real street. I could have coffee or tea with my friends, and I could go shopping. On the reservation, I could buy the basic necessities at the trading post, and occasionally peddlers would come by with maybe some fruit, or if they happened to have butchered an animal, with a piece of meat to supplement our diet. And we had a garden, grow pumpkins and squash and things like that. But if we wanted anything more than that, we had to send for it all the way to San Francisco. And things were dear. I think I sewed new soles on John's carpet slippers 6 times before we were able to afford a new pair, because they cost $1.65. When John wanted a suit, it was $20. It took us years to save up that much. And now I'm in Oshkosh, and you can go to a store and you can buy things. It was wonderful. One day, Pa gave me $10. He said, "You're going to need this when you get to the Arizona Territory, so please use it wisely." But I went to the store, and you know, those ribbons were so pretty, and there was a cape that just fit me perfectly, and a bonnet for Marguerite, and some clothes things for the new baby, and then I bought several sausages to send to John, and the bill was $10.50. Oh, where does the money go? But it's fall now, and it's going on towards winter, and there's snow. There's snow again. When I was in Arizona, I remember the one time I looked out. It was high desert. We didn't see snow. But one day I looked out, and there were actual snowflakes falling, and the ground was white. And I was so excited, I ran out in my night clothes with only my slippers, and I danced and I danced and I danced in the snow. But now I'm back in Wisconsin, and there's much more snow, and I don't dance in it anymore at all. And then it's January, and the baby's born. His name is Carl Johannes. My father whisks him off to be baptized the very next Sunday. I couldn't even get out of bed. They didn't even let me go downstairs for a month. And it took until March before anybody decided that I was well enough to go back to the Arizona Territory. John came for me, and he was excited. Things were happening, he said. He said, I had a marriage. I actually had a wedding. It was the first Christian wedding on the entire reservation among all the Indian peoples there. It was in the papers and everything. And he said, best of all, I have 4 girls who want to be baptized. Baptized. I'm teaching them about baptism, he said. And so, on Easter Sunday, was John's 31st birthday, I remember that. Those 4 girls were baptized. They were the first fruits, the first tangible results of our mission work in 6 years. 4 baptisms. But it was wonderful. It was going to be a good future. But I looked at John, and I thought, he's not doing well. It can't only be the fact that he was doing his own cooking and everything for all these months, but I don't think he weighs more than 130 pounds. And since I'm back, I'm losing weight too. Something's wrong. The doctors at the base said, it's starvation of the heart. It's a disease that sometimes affects people who were born in a northern climate and now live in a hot and dry climate. If you stay, said the doctor, you will develop tuberculosis. And we knew we were going to have to leave. It was a sad day in November of the year 1899 when we said goodbye to our little house on the slopes of the Peridot Mesa and moved to Minnesota. We were at St. Peter's, Minnesota for 6 years, and then on to St. John's in St. Paul, where my John finished his ministry and I cared for Marguerite and the other children. But the story doesn't end, because the mission station could not be left empty, or another denomination could move in, and they would. As the Indian agent once explained to John, he said, missionaries are okay, as long as they don't mess in temporal things. But if they decide to do that, they are going to quickly discover that on a reservation, the Indian agent is more powerful than God Almighty himself. Well, we asked Paul Meyerhoff to come down from East Fork to stay in our little house, which he did. There were no restrictions up there. The seminary arranged for a young man to graduate early in December, and by January, Pastor Carl Ginther and a teacher, Rudolph Jentz, were established in Peridot. And it's true. One person plants, another harvests. Because that first year that Charles Ginther is in Peridot, he has several weddings and over a dozen baptisms. And by 1903, he's built the chapel, the tufa stone chapel that we had dreamed about for such a long, long time. God is blessing. The school is growing. Charles Ginther is dearly loved by the people. He's able to bring people together for services. He's still having classes down at San Carlos, as my John did, and services there. The work is growing. And then the teacher is killed in a buggy accident. And Charles Ginther is so busy, he can't find time to teach school as well. And the little school building sits empty. God has a plan for that little building as well. Because there's a pastor in Milwaukee who has health problems, comes to the Southwest, and he stays in our little one-room school for almost a year. His name is Gustav Harders. He noticed that the Apaches were moving to Globe, where the copper mines were flourishing, and he said to Ginther, you should start a mission there. But there weren't enough hours in the day for him to do that. Long story short, Gustav Harders returns to Milwaukee. His problems return. The mission board sends him a call to begin a congregation in Globe. And he does. He brings his family. He buys a house. He builds a church out of scrap wood and whatever he could find. He has a school. The school has a hot lunch program, which he provided for by baking food from all the restaurants in the area. And he's looking after all the other missionaries in the area. Because by this time, there's more. There isn't just Charles Ginther down south, but and Paul Meyerhoff up north. There's more coming in places like Sibicu and Show Low and McNary and all those places that you saw pictures of in your narthex. It's growing. None of them are staying very long. It's very, very hard. Language is still a barrier. Gustav Harders encouraged them, learn the language and learn your people and teach them how to worship together. And so there's several in different places, like, as I said, over in Sibicu, the pastor that comes to Sibicu is named Pastor Zuberbeer, which is a relative of your pastor. And he stayed there about 7 or 8 years. God is working. God is working in all things as he always does. Gustav Harders is able to preach to people in Spanish. He even had some Chinese people he was ministering to, and always encouraging the missionaries everywhere. So that when he died in about 1917, it marked an end. Actually, it marked the end of the beginning, of those first years of working in Apache land. Because the next 25 years, in fact, the next 50 years, things are different. The missionaries that come in this second section stay. They stay and then devote their entire lives to the mission work. Pastor Ginther, who is no relation to the other Ginther at all, stayed with his wife, Minnie, stayed for over 50 years. They established a nursery for children. There was a school. There was a boarding school, even eventually a high school there at East Fork. And then there was the Upleggers down in the southern reservation. Pastor Uplegger, who had great skills with language, who gave the Apaches their first written language, and also helped the Apaches write their constitutions. It's a blessing to people everywhere. And there's schools. There's schools in Civicue. There's schools at White River. There's schools in East Fork. There's schools in San Carlos and Bailos, or Peridot and Bailos. And there's teachers. There's teachers that come, many of them. One of them, Deb Shue, is a member of your congregation. And the blessings abound. One of those teachers is even my great-grandson, who taught in Peridot for many years. It's overwhelming. Those men devoted their entire lives to working among the Apache people. Pastor Rosine had 150 children in his school, and all the other schools were blossoming as well. But now it's 125 years since John and I first made our home in that little house on the slopes of the great Peridot Mesa. We had 4 baptisms. And now, every Sunday, there's more than 4,000 Apache people who are worshiping their Lord and Savior, just as you do, every single Sunday. And it doesn't even begin to count the thousands of them who are already in heaven and whom you'll meet when you get there someday. I am so blessed to have been a small part of this great work. God is good. God is great. And I thank him over and over again for the blessings in my life. And all I can say is, to God be the glory. Thank you. Any questions?